What happens when a millionaire husband abandons his pregnant wife during labor to party on a yacht with his glamorous mistress? Meet Ethan Cole, a man who had it all and nearly lost everything. His betrayal shattered Grace, but what followed was an emotional journey of heartbreak, karma, and a long road to redemption. Will love ever be enough to rebuild what was broken? This story will grip your heart, challenge your beliefs, and leave you breathless. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to hear more unforgettable stories like this one. Ethan Cole had always known he was destined for more than the cold, rust-streaked streets of his Southside Chicago neighborhood. As a boy, he watched his single mother work double shifts as a nurse, her fingers always raw, her eyes always tired. Their tiny apartment smelled of antiseptic and old carpet, and though she never complained, Ethan noticed the way she winced when the heating bill came due or the way she rationed her dinners to stretch leftovers. He didn't hate their life. He respected it. But in the quiet hours of the night, when the city's noise faded into a far-off hum, Ethan would stare at the cracked ceiling above his bed and whisper to the dark, "I'm getting out. I'll give her more." By 17, he was already a prodigy in coding, hacking old-school computers to run his own programs, and taking online business classes on his cousin's borrowed laptop. He didn't hang out at the corner store or waste time at parties. Instead, he studied finance, digital marketing, and startup culture, like his life depended on it, because it did. Every scholarship, every opportunity, every odd job he took, tutoring neighborhood kids or fixing phones, was another rung on the ladder. By the time he earned a full ride to Stanford, his mother cried so hard she couldn't speak, only held his acceptance letter to her chest like a lifeline. At Stanford, Ethan thrived in a world that initially felt like another planet. While his classmates talked about ski trips in Aspen or summers in the Hamptons, Ethan quietly coded in the dorm basement, launching apps that solved real problems, like a job board for low-income neighborhoods or an AI chatbot to help immigrants navigate city paperwork. He didn't just want money. He wanted legacy. It was during a business ethics seminar his junior year that he first saw Grace Delaney. She walked in 5 minutes late, her hair pulled up in a soft bun, oversized notebook clutched to her chest, cheeks flushed from running across campus. She apologized to the professor with such gentle sincerity that the room, for a moment, softened. Ethan didn't believe in love at first sight, but he believed in gravity. And suddenly, she had it. She sat 2 rows in front of him, scribbling notes furiously in her loopy cursive, occasionally biting her lip when she was confused. He found himself leaning forward, trying to read what she wrote. When she raised her hand to argue a point about moral responsibility in corporate practices, her voice was steady and passionate, and Ethan was captivated. They didn't speak until 2 weeks later, when she lingered after class to discuss a case study with the professor. Ethan stayed too, pretending to pack his laptop slower than usual. When she turned and caught his eye, she offered that same open smile that had charmed the entire classroom on her first day. "You seem like you disagree with everything Professor Lambert says," she teased, but in a good way. That was the start. They grabbed coffee, then dinner. They debated capitalism over cheap sushi, talked late into the night about their wildly different upbringings. Grace was the daughter of East Coast philanthropists, raised on legacy and summer charity galas. Her family had money, real money, but they wore it quietly, channeling it into community work and educational programs for marginalized groups. Unlike many of their peers, Grace didn't see wealth as a badge. She saw it as a tool. Ethan had never met someone like her. She found his ambition magnetic, his confidence invigorating. He was intense, driven, but also surprisingly funny, with dry, self-aware wit that caught her off guard. He had this way of looking at her, like she was sunlight after a life of shadows. She admired how he never apologized for dreaming big, but he listened when she reminded him that impact mattered more than numbers. They balanced each other. Ethan encouraged Grace to take risks in her social initiatives, to think bigger than just soup kitchens and donation drives. Grace taught Ethan to pause, to breathe, to reflect. She challenged him to consider the consequences of growth without conscience. "What's the point of building an empire?" she once asked him as they lay under the stars in Golden Gate Park, if it just sits on a crumbling foundation. By graduation, they were inseparable. Ethan proposed to her on the coast, the Pacific crashing against the rocks behind them, the sunset blushing the sky in hues of gold and coral. He didn't have a giant ring or an elaborate plan, just a quiet moment, kneeling on the sand, a simple silver band in his palm. "I don't have the legacy," he whispered, "but I'll build one, with you." Grace, tears in her eyes, said yes without hesitation. Their wedding was a blend of simplicity and elegance. Grace wore a satin gown passed down from her grandmother, and Ethan's tuxedo was custom-tailored by a friend who owed him a favor. They danced barefoot in a garden lit by fairy lights, surrounded by friends, family, and faculty who had watched their story unfold. There was laughter, there were toasts, and for a while it felt like the universe had aligned just for them. After the honeymoon, Ethan launched his startup, NextWave, a tech platform focused on sustainable AI solutions for environmental causes. It was bold, disruptive, and backed by Grace's quiet network of venture philanthropists. Within 2 years, NextWave made headlines. Ethan graced Forbes' 30 Under 30, and Grace's work with youth education initiatives won her national acclaim. They were the couple that inspired headlines like, "Brains and Hearts, the Coles are changing the game." They bought a sleek penthouse in San Francisco's Marina District with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the Bay Bridge. But their home was more than luxury. It was warm, filled with books, photos, and laughter. Grace kept fresh flowers in every room. Ethan installed a coffee machine that made the perfect almond latte, just for her. They had routines: Sunday brunch, late-night brainstorming, weekly volunteer shifts at the youth center. When Grace discovered she was pregnant, it was unplanned but joyfully received. Ethan laughed when she showed him the test, then cried, then wrapped her in a hug so tight she could barely breathe. "You're going to be the best mother," he said, and meant it. They spent weekends painting the nursery in soft sage green, arguing playfully over names. Ethan read every parenting book he could find, while Grace knitted baby blankets with her mother. From the outside, their life was charmed, but pressure mounts even on perfect pictures. NextWave expanded faster than anyone predicted. Investors wanted more, and suddenly Ethan was flying to Dubai, Singapore, and London. Grace, meanwhile, dealt with morning sickness and the emotional roller coaster of pregnancy largely on her own. She didn't complain. She knew Ethan was building something great. But at night, when she laid her hand over her belly and felt a flutter, she wished he were there to feel it too. Ethan began missing appointments. Then dinners, then entire weekends. When she called, he sounded distracted, always on the verge of closing something huge. His absences were no longer justifiable by ambition. They became routine. Grace told herself it was temporary. She clung to the idea that once the baby arrived, things would calm down. And then, at a tech conference in Los Angeles, Ethan met Sienna Voss. She was everything the new Ethan was learning to admire: magnetic, cunning, seductive. A former fashion PR executive turned influencer investor, Sienna had cultivated a brand around power and allure. She was clever with words, sharp with timing, and she played the game of admiration with precision. Ethan noticed her because she noticed him. She praised his keynote speech with intoxicating charm, leaned in too close during cocktail hour, and told him he reminded her of what real men used to be like, before everyone got soft. At first it was harmless. Texts, drinks, an almost kiss in the back of a black car. Ethan returned home from that trip quiet, distracted, and guilt-ridden. He watched Grace fold tiny onesies and wondered what the hell he was doing. But a week later, he got another message from Sienna, this time an invitation to a private dinner to discuss a fashion tech initiative. He told Grace it was a late investor meeting. That dinner became a pattern. One text became 10. One lie became many. And slowly, the man who once stared at cracked ceilings, whispering dreams of escape, now found himself standing at the edge of betrayal, poised to lose everything he had once sworn he would protect. Grace didn't know it yet, but her fairy tale was beginning to fracture. And Ethan, drunk on power, attention, and the illusion of invincibility, was about to learn the price of forgetting where he came from and who had loved him through it all. The beginning of their married life felt like a series of perfect snapshots. Grace and Ethan were the kind of couple people gravitated toward at events: magnetic, accomplished, deeply in sync. Their love felt real, grounded not only in passion but in shared values. Grace would often wake early and watch Ethan asleep beside her, the morning light filtering across his jawline. He looked peaceful then, stripped of ambition and exhaustion. She'd run her fingers lightly through his hair and smile, whispering promises to their unborn child about the life they were building. But time has a way of reshaping even the sturdiest of bonds. What starts as a small shift in rhythm can eventually swell into a fracture if left unspoken. It began with the calendar. Ethan suddenly overbooked days, his travel plans that seemed to spring up with barely a moment's notice. One day he was in Seattle meeting with green tech innovators. The next in Berlin discussing climate-neutral data centers. The expansion of NextWave was meteoric. His name was on every shortlist for Tech Visionary of the Year. Venture capitalists circled him like bees to nectar. Forbes called him the disruptor with a conscience, and even Grace felt proud reading the articles at first. But with every accolade came a price. Ethan became harder to reach, not just physically but emotionally. He answered her texts with quick replies, often emojis or vague promises like "we'll call later." When he did call, he sounded rushed, his voice clipped as if always on the verge of clicking into another meeting. Grace chalked it up to stress, convinced herself it was just a busy season. Still, the little things began to hurt more than she expected. He missed their second sonogram appointment, texting a hurried, "Sorry," landed late, just as she sat in the sterile clinic room staring at the flickering image of their baby's heartbeat. She smiled anyway, took a photo of the screen, and sent it to him with the caption, "Your child says hi." Ethan replied with a red heart and nothing else. Their evenings together grew rare. When they did sit across from each other at their sleek marble kitchen island, Grace would ask how his meetings went. Ethan answered in sound bites, "Went great. Big things coming." Then he'd dive into emails, thumb scrolling endlessly on his phone while she tried to fight back the growing silence. And somewhere in the chaos of scaling a company and preparing for parenthood, Sienna Voss found her moment to slide in. They crossed paths again at a sustainable design expo in LA. Ethan had just given a keynote speech on using AI to drive environmental justice, and his inbox was exploding with praise. Sienna appeared at the cocktail lounge afterward in a sleek navy jumpsuit, sipping something expensive and pretending not to notice the stares she attracted. "I was hoping you'd show," she said as he passed her table. Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "Were you?" she smiled. "You're a rare mix, Ethan Cole. Brains, power, and a decent suit." Railing, most men in tech can only manage 2 of the 3. He laughed, flattered despite himself. She invited him to sit. 1 drink turned into 3. They talked startups, market trends, personal branding. She told him about her luxury eco-brand launch and how she was curating investors who understood both substance and style. Every word from her lips dripped with flattery, carefully measured to make Ethan feel irreplaceable. He didn't mention Grace. Not once. Sienna didn't need to know. Or maybe she already did. When he returned to San Francisco the next evening, Grace greeted him with that soft smile she always wore when she was trying not to seem worried. She had cooked his favorite, chili lime salmon with coconut rice. The apartment smelled like warmth and home. Ethan kissed her cheek, his lips brushing too lightly, as if distracted. She didn't ask where he'd really been. Maybe she didn't want the answer. As the weeks passed, Ethan's world split into 2 distinct spheres. One was public, warm, accomplished, philanthropic. He still spoke at charity galas beside Grace, still posted pictures of their nursery on social media, with captions like, "Building something beautiful." He was admired, envied, even called a modern Renaissance man. The other world was private, electrified, secretive, and dangerous. Texts from Sienna slid into his phone late at night. "Thinking of your eyes today, those dark ones that never lie, until they do." He knew he should delete them. He didn't. Sometimes they'd meet under the guise of advisory sessions. Sienna claimed to need his expertise. Ethan told himself he was mentoring her. They met in corner booths of rooftop bars, in private lounges at tech conferences, and eventually in her suite at the Avalon Hotel in Beverly Hills. Their first kiss was both expected and shocking. One moment, they were reviewing mock-ups for her fashion tech campaign. The next, she leaned in, her perfume dizzying, her lips brushing his with calculated softness. He didn't pull away. When he returned home that time, Grace noticed the change. "You smell different," she murmured as he wrapped his arms around her from behind. "Something floral." He hesitated. "Just the hotel lobby. They were piping some ridiculous scent through the vents." She didn't press him. But that night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her hands protectively over her belly. The baby kicked gently, and tears slipped quietly down the sides of her face. Sienna, meanwhile, wove herself deeper into Ethan's life. She began appearing at investor parties, dropping his name casually. "Oh, Ethan, we're discussing something big. He sees real value in my work." She uploaded suggestive selfies that mirrored locations Ethan had just visited. Never with him in frame, but always close enough to whisper implication. Melissa, Grace's best friend and sharp as a razor, noticed. She showed Grace a photo from a blog post, Sienna laughing beside a man whose face was out of view, but whose watch matched Ethan's exactly. "I know that Rolex," Melissa said flatly. Grace stared at the screen, her chest constricted. "I'm sure it's nothing," she whispered. But doubt had already entered the room, and it would not be leaving quietly. Grace tried harder after that. She bought new clothes, planned quiet dinners, enrolled in prenatal yoga. She massaged Ethan's temples when he came home late, listened patiently when he ranted about deadlines. She made lists of baby names and left sticky notes with jokes on the fridge. She loved him with everything she had left. But something inside Ethan had shifted. Not completely. Not yet. He still loved Grace, in the way people love their home countries even after living abroad too long. He cherished her decency, her strength, the way her eyes lit up when she felt the baby move. But he also craved the rush Sienna gave him. The adrenaline of being wanted without conditions, the illusion that he was a man free of consequence. He didn't see that the real consequence was unfolding before him, quietly, painfully, in the soft sighs Grace gave when he canceled dinner. In the way she started talking more to Melissa than to him. In the letters she began writing in her journal at night. Letters to their unborn child about bravery, betrayal, and choosing to love yourself even when others don't. One afternoon, Grace found a receipt in his jacket pocket, a boutique hotel in Manhattan. He'd told her he was in Boston. She didn't cry. She folded the paper and placed it back exactly where she found it. Later at dinner, she asked, "Do you feel like you're living two lives?" Ethan looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said calmly, "do you ever feel like one of them will catch up to the other and ruin everything?" He paused. "Where is this coming from?" Grace smiled, tired and kind. "From a place that used to trust you without question." He reached for her hand, but she pulled it away gently. "It's okay," she said. "You don't have to answer." Afterward, she sat alone in the nursery, the soft hum of the white noise machine filling the silence. She placed a hand on her belly and whispered, "Whatever happens, I've got you." And somewhere across the city, in a penthouse suite lit by designer fixtures and champagne bubbles, Ethan scrolled through photos of himself with Grace, then closed his phone and turned back toward Sienna, smiling, seductive, waiting. He told himself he was just buying time, but time, as always, was about to run out. The pull of two worlds began to tear Ethan from the inside out. On the surface, he was still the successful founder of NextWave, still the visionary tech leader gracing magazine covers, still the husband of a woman whose integrity was whispered about in rooms full of philanthropy elites. He played his role masterfully, charming at galas, quick-witted in boardrooms, casually attentive at home, just enough to silence suspicion. But beneath the polished exterior, the current had changed. Ethan no longer felt rooted. He was drifting between identities, between loyalties, between the man Grace believed in and the man he was quietly becoming. Sienna Voss had made herself impossible to ignore. She didn't chase. That was her magic. She waited, poised and magnetic, letting Ethan come to her, and he did, more and more frequently. What began as an emotional escape had evolved into something physical, clandestine, and dangerously intoxicating. Her apartment on Russian Hill became his sanctuary of temptation. A place without expectations, where he wasn't a husband, a father-to-be, or a CEO. He was just a man being worshipped. Sienna understood timing. She never demanded too much, always retreating just far enough to make Ethan chase her again. She wore silk and cashmere and always smelled like honey and danger. She studied his interviews, quoted back his own words during their conversations. "You're building the future," she would say, pressing her lips to his ear. "Don't let anyone chain you to the past." It was seduction by validation, and Ethan, for all his intellect, couldn't resist being told he was exceptional. Meanwhile, Grace moved through their apartment like a ghost of herself. She still folded his laundry, still ordered his favorite tie on Thursdays, still hummed lullabies to their unborn child. But something in her had closed. A quiet door, shutting slowly. She didn't ask about the late nights anymore. She didn't question the cologne that clung to his shirts, floral and foreign, not the musky wood scent she'd chosen for him last Christmas. Instead, she made room. She cleared out a drawer in the nursery marked Dad's Things, but didn't fill it. She organized doctor's appointment cards and put them on the fridge under a single magnet shaped like a star. Ethan rarely noticed them. When she told him about the baby kicking, he smiled distantly and asked, "Was it strong?" Then drifted back into emails. Melissa noticed. Always perceptive, she started dropping by unannounced. Grace never said anything directly, but Melissa saw it in her face. The exhaustion, the uncertainty, the desperate hope that still clung to the corners of her mouth like dust. One afternoon, as they folded baby clothes in the sunroom, Melissa held up a onesie and said, "Does he even know how soft this is?" Grace didn't answer. She simply reached for another item and said, "He's just distracted. It's a big time for him." Melissa exhaled. "It's a big time for you too." Ethan's dual life became an elaborate choreography. He kept separate calendars, separate passwords, even separate stories about where he'd been. When Grace called while he was with Sienna, he'd silence his phone and claim poor reception later. Once, she called 3 times in a row. Sienna had watched from the kitchen island, swirling her wine. "She's pregnant, isn't she?" she asked casually. Ethan froze. "I never said that." "You didn't have to," she smiled. "The way you tense up when your phone lights up, it's the guilt. You're not very good at hiding it." He stood there, phone buzzing in his hand, unsure whether to answer or toss it across the room. Eventually, it stopped ringing. "She's a good woman?" he said quietly, eyes lowered. Sienna walked over, placing her hands on his chest. "I'm not asking you to hate her. I'm asking you to be honest about what you want." But Ethan didn't know anymore. At night, when he lay next to Grace, if he made it home at all, he would sometimes reach for her, brush her shoulder, wanting comfort. She often stirred but didn't respond. It was the silence that killed him most. He could survive anger. He could endure a fight, but this quiet heartbreak, this absence of confrontation, it left him unmoored. One morning, Grace stood at the window, holding her belly, her profile glowing in the rising light. "Do you think our child will be like you?" she asked softly. Ethan was halfway into his blazer, adjusting the cuffs. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she turned to him, ambitious, restless, searching for something bigger than love. He looked at her, mouth open slightly, unsure how to respond. "I hope not," she added, and turned back to the view. That same afternoon, Ethan met Sienna for lunch at a rooftop bistro overlooking the bay. She was wearing a dress the color of pomegranate, her skin golden in the sunlight. She poured him a drink before he even sat down. "I have a proposal," she said, sliding a folder across the table. Inside were pitch decks for her luxury sustainable clothing line, poised for an IPO within 18 months. "I want you to be my lead investor, publicly. I want your name tied to mine." Ethan's heart skipped. "That's a big ask." She leaned in, her voice low. "It's not just business. This is a future, yours and mine." He swallowed hard, the sun suddenly too bright. "I need time." "Time," she echoed, "is the one thing you're running out of." Back home, Grace discovered a letter tucked between tax documents in Ethan's office drawer. It was from a law firm in New York, confidential paperwork regarding an investor agreement under Sienna's brand. Ethan hadn't told her. Her hands shook as she folded the letter back and placed it exactly where she found it. That night, she made Ethan's favorite dinner, filet mignon with roasted garlic mashed potatoes. She lit candles. She wore the sapphire earrings he'd given her on their anniversary. He didn't come home. Grace waited at the table for 2 hours before blowing out the candles, wrapping the food, and writing a note in cursive on a napkin. "I'm trying to remember who we were before all this." The next day, Grace went to her OB appointment alone. The technician showed her the baby on screen, a tiny hand brushing its face, a flickering heart steady and strong. "It's a boy," the doctor said with a smile. Grace blinked, and for a second, her chest felt too tight to breathe. She touched the screen gently. "Hello, little man," she whispered. "You're already stronger than your father." Ethan arrived home that night after midnight. He smelled of wine and leather. Grace didn't ask. She was already in bed, pretending to sleep. But her hand was curled around the ultrasound printout, held like a secret beneath her pillow. The next morning she left it on the kitchen table. Ethan found it while making coffee. His fingers hovered over the image, trembling. For a moment the world slowed. A boy. He should have felt joy, or pride, or something brighter than this choking wave of guilt. But all he felt was dread. Because he knew, deep in the part of him that still remembered cracked ceilings and whispered dreams, that he was becoming the man he once swore he'd never be. That afternoon, he met Sienna again. This time, she was waiting at the marina. A friend of hers owned a yacht, and she wanted Ethan to see it. "Imagine launching the brand here," she said, walking barefoot on the deck. "Exclusive, elite, unforgettable." Ethan stared at the water, the sun blinding on the surface. Somewhere beneath the waves, he could feel it, the weight of everything sinking, his marriage, his integrity, his soul. "Come on," Sienna called, holding out her hand. "Let's sail." And Ethan, already untethered, stepped forward. Back home, Grace stood in the nursery, surrounded by soft blues and pale grays, her hands cradling her belly. She looked at the empty drawer labeled Dad's Things and whispered a quiet prayer. "Let my son know what love looks like, even if it has to come from me alone." And far away, as the yacht pulled from the dock and laughter echoed across the deck, Ethan's phone buzzed in his jacket pocket 3 times. He didn't hear it. And in that silence, everything began to unravel. The August heat hung thick in the San Francisco air, pressing against the city like a second skin. Grace sat alone in the penthouse, curled on the edge of the couch, a parenting book resting across her thighs like a shield. Outside the window, the bay glistened, deceptively calm. Inside, the air was electric with waiting. She was 37 weeks pregnant, swollen, exhausted, and trying desperately to keep herself grounded. Ethan had promised he'd be back that night. He had told her it was a brief meeting with a potential investor across the bay. Nothing overnight, nothing worth worrying about. Grace had nodded, her voice flat but agreeable. She'd stopped challenging his explanations. The truth had long since become irrelevant in their conversations. He was not across the bay. He was on a yacht off the coast of Sausalito, champagne in hand, laughter rising around him like smoke. Sienna draped herself over a sunbed in a silver dress that caught every drop of light and flung it back like fire. The yacht belonged to one of her newest connections, a flamboyant crypto investor named Milo Varek, who threw Gatsby-style parties and believed in excess as a lifestyle. The boat itself was less of a vessel and more of a floating palace. 2 stories, a hot tub, velvet seating, and a waitstaff that moved like ghosts. Ethan had hesitated when Sienna first invited him. "Come unwind," she had purred over the phone. "One night. That's all. You need it." He had stood at the window of his office, staring down at the street below, where a father pushed a stroller across the crosswalk. He almost said no, almost. But something inside him, the selfish, untethered part, whispered that one night wouldn't matter. Grace was fine. She had Melissa, her parents, on speed dial. The baby wasn't due for another couple of weeks. He deserved this. So he went. Back at the penthouse, Grace's body stiffened as a sharp pain lanced through her abdomen. It was quick, deep, and far more brutal than the fluttery Braxton Hicks contractions she'd grown used to. She gasped, gripping the side of the couch, the book sliding to the floor. Her heart pounded. She waited, breath shallow. The pain dulled. A minute passed, then another. Stronger, deeper. A cold sweat broke across her skin. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone. She dialed Ethan. 1 ring. 2. Straight to voicemail. She tried again, and again. Nothing. "Ethan," she said breathlessly into the recording. I think it's happening. I need you to come home, please." Her vision blurred. She scrolled and called Melissa. "Grace?" Melissa answered immediately, cheerful. "What's up?" "I think I'm in labor," Grace stammered, her voice rising. "I can't get a hold of Ethan." Melissa, I need you." "I'm on my way." Melissa said, already grabbing her keys. By the time Melissa arrived, Grace was pacing slowly in the foyer, one hand gripping the wall, the other cradling her belly. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and glistening. They drove to the hospital through rush-hour traffic, Melissa talking to Grace the whole time, trying to keep her grounded, present. The pain came in waves. The car was filled with the sound of Grace's breathing, heavy and strained, and the hum of tires on pavement. At the hospital, nurses rushed her into a wheelchair, and the bright fluorescent lights of the maternity ward swallowed her whole. Meanwhile, miles away, Ethan stood on the deck of the yacht, a glass of chilled rosé in his hand, his laughter mingling with the sounds of music and water. Sienna leaned into him, her fingers trailing his collar. The stars blinked awake above them, and he felt, for a fleeting moment, completely outside of time. His phone was inside his jacket, tossed carelessly over a lounge chair, buzzing furiously in a pocket he wasn't checking. Grace gripped Melissa's hand as the doctor explained her labor had progressed rapidly. The baby's heart rate was dipping with each contraction. The team was prepping for a possible emergency C-section. Grace nodded through tears, too exhausted to respond. Every fiber of her being screamed for Ethan. Every cell begged for him to walk through that door. But he didn't. She was wheeled into the delivery room alone, surrounded by strangers and beeping machines. Melissa stayed by her side, whispering encouragement, brushing sweat-soaked hair from her brow. And still, Ethan was unreachable. Eventually, someone tried his phone again. The nurse frowned. Voicemail. Again. Grace gritted her teeth and pushed through the pain. By the time Ethan wandered back inside the cabin to grab another drink, he noticed his phone lighting up on the seat. He paused, staring at the number flashing on the screen. It was Melissa. He picked up. "Where the hell have you been?" Melissa's voice tore through the speaker. "Whoa, what?" "Grace is in labor, Ethan. She's been calling you for hours. The baby, he's coming now." The glass fell from his hand and shattered on the floor. He didn't respond, didn't breathe. "Get here," Melissa growled. "Now." The line went dead. Sienna appeared in the doorway, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "What's going on?" He didn't answer. He grabbed his jacket, phone clutched in a death grip, and stumbled onto the deck. The realization hit him like a punch to the chest. His son, his wife, alone, in pain. "Get me off this boat," he barked at the first crew member he saw. The man blinked. "Sir, the launch won't be back until dawn." "I don't care," Ethan shouted. "I need a motorboat, anything." It took 40 agonizing minutes before someone agreed to take him back. The engine roared beneath him as the motorboat tore through the dark water. The wind lashed his face, but he barely felt it. His heart pounded in his throat, his stomach twisted into knots. He was too late. He knew it. The hospital was bathed in harsh light when he finally arrived. He sprinted through the doors, hair wild, shirt soaked with sea spray and sweat. A nurse at the front desk looked up. "Grace Cole," he rasped. "Maternity, please." She eyed him, judgment in her silence. Then pointed down the hall, room 403. He stumbled down the corridor, his footsteps echoing like thunder. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open. Grace lay in the bed, pale and exhausted, cradling a small bundle wrapped in blue. Her face was turned away from the door. Melissa stood at her side, her expression unreadable. Ethan stepped inside. "Grace," he whispered. "I'm here." She turned her head slowly. Her eyes met his, but there was no anger in them. Only devastation. Cold, empty devastation. "You weren't," she said softly. "When it mattered, you weren't." He moved closer, tears already falling, but Melissa stepped between them. "Not now," she said sharply. "You don't get to fix this tonight." Ethan stopped, trembling. Grace pressed her lips to their son's forehead. The baby cooed softly, unaware of the pain that clung to the air. "What's his name?" Ethan asked, voice cracking. Grace didn't look at him. "I named him Elijah." Ethan nodded, barely breathing. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Grace closed her eyes. "So am I." And just like that, the distance between them became a canyon too wide to cross with words alone. Ethan stood in the hallway outside her room for hours. The nurses passed by him like shadows. He didn't move. He didn't think. He just sat. The weight of what he'd missed pressed against his chest, suffocating him. All the things he thought he needed, admiration, power, freedom, they dissolved under the weight of one simple truth. He had not been there when his son took his first breath. And no amount of remorse could rewrite that moment. At dawn, he finally rose and left. Not because he wanted to, but because he understood, deeply, painfully, that he no longer had a place there. Not yet, maybe not ever. And as the city stirred awake, as light bled across the horizon, Ethan Cole walked into a world forever changed. Behind him, a mother held her child close, rocking gently in the silence. Ahead of him lay the long, uncertain road to redemption. But first, he would have to face the ruins of what he'd destroyed. The morning sun spilled across the marble floors of the penthouse like a cruel reminder of everything Ethan had lost. The air inside was still, too still, like the breath had been sucked out of the place. He dropped his keys onto the console table with a hollow clink and stood in the doorway, staring into the silence. His clothes were rumpled, his eyes bloodshot from a night of no sleep and too many regrets. He had spent the last few hours on a hospital bench, watching the door to room 403, hoping for something. An invitation inside, a moment of grace. But all he received was silence and the echo of Grace's words ringing in his ears. You weren't here when it mattered. He wandered through the apartment like a ghost, each room taunting him with memories. The nursery, freshly painted in soft blues and grays, smelled faintly of baby powder and lavender. There, on the rocking chair, lay a folded baby blanket with Elijah's name embroidered in delicate thread. Ethan reached out to touch it, but stopped, fingers curling in midair. He had no right. In the living room, he found one of Grace's maternity books still lying open, pages slightly curled, a note in her handwriting tucked between the chapters. For when you feel scared, remember, you're not alone. He sank into the couch and held the note to his chest. But the comfort it once might have offered was gone. The fallout began swiftly. Secrets, especially ones dressed in scandal and luxury, had a way of slipping through even the tightest cracks. It started with whispers. Melissa, who had watched Grace break down more times than she could count, couldn't stay silent. She shared the truth with a few close friends, the kind of people who lunched with investors and hosted charity balls. The story took off like a lit match in a dry forest. He missed the birth, someone murmured at a gala. Wasn't he on a yacht with that influencer? Another added, lowering her glass. Within 48 hours, Boston's elite circles, philanthropists, tech moguls, media personalities, were buzzing with the tale of Ethan Cole's betrayal. The narrative was too juicy to ignore. The millionaire husband skipping the birth of his firstborn to party with a woman in designer heels and questionable morals. It was a morality play, and everyone chose a side. Next Wave's board, already uneasy about Ethan's increasingly erratic behavior, convened an emergency meeting. Investors had begun to pull out. A few of the most promising startups in their portfolio suddenly rescinded partnership offers. Public sentiment was souring, and the optics were unforgivable. We have to consider the long-term brand, one board member said, eyeing Ethan across the table. We're not judging your personal life, another added, but it's affecting your leadership. That was a lie, of course. They were judging every bit of it. And Ethan knew it. They voted, unanimously, to suspend him from his CEO role, citing reputational risk and leadership concerns. The press release was carefully worded. Ethan Cole to step back from day-to-day operations to focus on family and personal matters. But the world read between the lines. Ethan left the office with his name still on the glass door, but without the weight it once carried. Back in New Hampshire, Grace had already packed her things. Her father sent a driver to the city, and 2 days after Elijah's birth, she and the baby left the penthouse behind. She said nothing to Ethan, just left a note on the kitchen counter. Elijah and I need peace. Please don't follow us, G. The Caldwell estate was everything the penthouse wasn't. Green, quiet, wrapped in ivy and years of legacy. Grace's mother wept quietly the day they arrived. Her father hugged her with a gentleness that masked his barely contained fury. No one spoke Ethan's name for weeks. Grace barely did either. Her focus was Elijah, feeding him, bathing him, learning his sounds and cries and rhythms. When he smiled for the first time, she cried alone, holding his tiny hand to her lips. Ethan sent gifts, an Italian bassinet, a custom-made bracelet, handwritten letters. They were all returned, unopened. Grace's message was clear: you don't get to buy your way back. But Ethan wasn't only being shut out by Grace. Sienna, too, was unraveling. She hadn't anticipated the backlash. She thought she could spin the story in her favor, portray herself as misunderstood, paint Ethan as a man torn between two worlds. But the media wasn't interested in nuance. They painted her as the other woman, the villain in silk. Her brand suffered. Endorsements were pulled. Fashion Week invitations dried up. Influencers unfollowed her in droves. She called Ethan, furious. "You said this wouldn't touch me," she snapped. "I didn't say anything," he replied coldly. "You assumed. I'm being crucified out here," she hissed. "You owe me." "I owe you nothing." She was silent for a beat. Then, her voice changed. "Maybe it's time I share our messages," she said sweetly. "Our photos, our transactions." It wasn't just a threat, it was blackmail. Sienna had receipts, text messages, wire transfers, images from their time on the yacht, enough to destroy what little reputation Ethan had left. He didn't fight. He wired her a lump sum, large enough to make her disappear, small enough not to raise alarms. It bought silence, but not peace. He spent his days in the penthouse like a man exiled in his own kingdom. Every room reminded him of Grace, of Elijah. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't breathe without guilt pressing into his ribs like broken glass. He'd stare at the crib, untouched. The bottle warmer, the tiny socks still in their drawer. Each artifact a monument to the life he'd shattered. One night, he found an old wedding photo in a drawer. Grace was laughing, her head thrown back, veil fluttering in the wind. Ethan, younger, brighter, was looking at her like she was the center of the universe. He stared at that photo until sunrise, and when the light hit the glass, he knew something had to change. He checked himself into therapy. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't for show. It was survival. The first sessions were brutal. He hated being vulnerable, hated acknowledging what he'd become. But slowly, his walls cracked. He talked about growing up poor, about watching his mother work herself to the bone, about swearing he'd never be powerless again. He talked about Grace, how she made him feel seen, real, worthy, and how he'd buried that feeling beneath ego and greed. "Is this the legacy you want to pass on?" his therapist asked one day. Ethan blinked. "No," he whispered. Back in New Hampshire, Grace heard about his therapy through a mutual friend. She said nothing. She didn't believe in second chances handed out like favors. Trust, she had learned, wasn't just earned, it was rebuilt brick by brick, slowly, with sweat and tears and time. Ethan began sending letters, not apologies but reflections, not explanations but honesty. Grace didn't respond, but she read every one. One day he sent a simple message. "Can I meet him? Just once. Supervised, your terms." She waited a week before replying, "Yes." It was the first word she'd sent in months. Ethan cried when he read it. And as autumn arrived, he drove north, heart pounding, hands shaking. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't chasing power or prestige or redemption in anyone else's eyes. He just wanted to hold his son. And finally, after all the noise had faded, he was ready to listen. The autumn air was cool and brittle, heavy with the scent of fallen leaves and distant fireplaces. Ethan stood outside the Caldwell estate, hands jammed into his coat pockets, heart hammering against his ribs like it might break free. The last time he'd seen Grace, she had looked through him like he was air. Painful, invisible, unnecessary. And yet today she had agreed to let him meet his son. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even hope. But it was a door, cracked open just enough for light to filter through. He exhaled as the front door swung open. Grace didn't greet him. A staff member did, polite and distant, ushering him into a room off the main hallway. It was warm inside, plush rugs, soft lighting, walls lined with old books and baby photos in gold frames. It felt like a place built for healing. Then the door opened again, and there he was, Elijah. Grace walked in holding him gently, wrapped in a pale blue blanket, a tuft of dark hair poking out from under a knit cap. Her face was unreadable, but her posture was protective, maternal, immovable. Ethan stood as if tethered by an invisible force. His breath caught in his throat. His knees nearly gave out. The baby blinked up at the unfamiliar man across the room. "Hi," Ethan whispered, his voice cracking. Grace didn't speak. She walked to the couch, sat down, and after a long pause motioned for Ethan to join her. He moved slowly, every step cautious, reverent. When he sat beside her, he didn't reach out. He just stared, drinking in every inch of his son's tiny face, the button nose, the curled fists, the impossibly soft eyelashes. "He has your mouth," Ethan said quietly. Grace said nothing. Minutes passed. Then, without a word, she shifted slightly and placed Elijah into his arms. Ethan froze. The weight of his son, warm, alive, miraculous, settled against his chest like the heaviest truth he'd ever held. Elijah blinked up at him, yawned, and curled a hand around Ethan's finger, and Ethan broke. Tears streamed down his face, unchecked and silent. All the shame, the guilt, the hollow nights spent staring at the nursery in that empty penthouse, they surged forward in a rush so violent he could hardly breathe. "I'm so sorry," he whispered to the baby, to Grace, to the ghosts of the man he used to be. "I should have been there. I should have never let go of what mattered." Grace's eyes welled, but she didn't cry. She had cried enough for both of them. "He deserves more," she said softly. "More than excuses, more than moments." "I know," Ethan replied, "and I don't expect anything from you. I just want a chance to show up for him, to show up for you, even if it's only from a distance." Grace looked at him then, really looked. Not through him, not past him, but at the man in front of her. He was thinner, paler, but his eyes were steady. And for the first time in a long while, they didn't hold that frantic gleam of self-preservation. They held humility. "We'll take it slow," she said. "Visits here, with supervision, no promises." He nodded. "That's more than I deserve." In the weeks that followed, Ethan kept his word. He drove to New Hampshire twice a week. He held Elijah, fed him bottles, changed diapers with trembling hands. He read picture books out loud with a soft, earnest tone that made Grace pause in the hallway just to listen. When Elijah cried, Ethan was the first to soothe him, his large hands awkward but gentle. When he smiled, Ethan would grin like it was the first miracle he'd ever seen. Outside the nursery, Ethan's transformation continued. He remained in therapy, digging deeper into the roots of his self-destruction. His therapist pushed him, challenged his assumptions about success, legacy, masculinity. "You chased power to escape powerlessness," she told him. "But somewhere along the way, you forgot that vulnerability isn't weakness, it's human." He started journaling, pages upon pages of unspoken truths. He sent Grace excerpts, never asking her to respond, just sharing. Sometimes she read them, sometimes she didn't. But she appreciated the effort. She saw the man trying, not the performative version, but the one who was finally brave enough to sit in his own discomfort. At Next Wave, the board was surprised when Ethan returned not to reclaim his throne but to support the new leadership. He offered insight, transparency, humility. He didn't fight to restore his title. He simply asked to help stabilize the company he once endangered. "I don't want power," he said in the first meeting. "I want to make things right, starting here." Investors were skeptical at first, but over time his quiet consistency won them back. He became an informal mentor to younger founders. He spoke less in public, but when he did, his words carried weight, because they came from somewhere honest. Grace watched from afar. She didn't allow herself to believe too quickly. Trust was slow medicine, but each time Ethan arrived on time, each time he stayed present, each time he left without pushing, something small inside her softened. One day, while Elijah napped, she offered him tea. They sat on the back patio, surrounded by trees turned amber and crimson. The silence between them was no longer jagged. It was contemplative, familiar. "You know," she said, staring at the horizon, "there were nights I thought I'd never look at you without anger." "I wouldn't blame you if you never did," Ethan replied. "But I do," she said. "Not entirely. Not always. It's strange. Grief and healing can live in the same place." He nodded. "Every time I hold him, I think about the night he was born, and how I wasn't there. That won't ever leave me." "It shouldn't," she said gently. "But it also shouldn't stop you from being here now." Their eyes met, and for the first time in over a year, they smiled at the same time. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't a rekindling. It was respect. Weeks turned into months. Winter crept in, blanketing the estate in frost. Ethan arrived with a shovel and cleared the front walkway himself. He didn't ask anyone else to do it, just rolled up his sleeves and worked. He brought books for Elijah, hand-picked and carefully wrapped. Grace watched him gently place a plush toy in the crib, linger for a second too long, then step away. And one evening, as the wind howled outside and the fireplace crackled within, Elijah took his first unassisted steps, right into Ethan's arms. Grace clapped and laughed and cried all at once. Ethan held their son tightly, his eyes wet with wonder. He looked up at Grace. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" for letting me witness this." She didn't answer. She just nodded, blinking fast, her hands trembling. Later that night, after Elijah had been put to bed, Ethan helped Grace clean the bottles. They moved in sync, as they once had in their old kitchen, before everything fell apart. "I don't know what the future looks like," Grace said, drying the last bottle. "Neither do I," he replied. "But I want to walk toward it with integrity, even if I'm alone." "You're not alone," she said after a long pause. "You're just not all the way back. Yet." Ethan smiled, quiet and grateful. And as he walked out into the snowy night, his boots crunching against the icy path, he looked back once. Grace stood at the window, holding Elijah. And for a moment, Ethan felt something he hadn't in a long, long time. Peace. The snow continued to fall, delicate as ash, blanketing the world outside in silence. Winter had wrapped the Caldwell estate in a kind of stillness that felt holy. Inside, however, the quiet was filled with new sounds. Elijah's giggles echoing down the hallways, the soft thud of tiny socks padding across wooden floors, Ethan's low, steady voice reading bedtime stories in the nursery each evening. He never stayed past 9. That was Grace's rule. Simple, firm, unspoken. And Ethan honored it. No matter how much he wanted to linger, to sit with her after Elijah had gone to sleep, to talk like they used to beneath the hush of starlight, he always gathered his things and left with a soft good night. But it was in those brief, stolen moments, her hand brushing his as she handed him a bottle, the shared laughter when Elijah tried to put his shoe on his head, that something began to shift. Not just between them, but within Grace. She noticed the way Ethan no longer reached for his phone during visits. How he showed up even on days when the snow made driving treacherous. How Elijah, now nearly walking, lit up whenever his father walked through the door. One afternoon, as she watched Ethan kneel in the playroom to help Elijah stack blocks, she caught herself smiling, not with nostalgia or longing, but with something gentler, something real. Later that evening, while folding tiny onesies fresh from the dryer, Grace stood in the laundry room holding one of Ethan's old t-shirts, left behind during one of the early visits. She brought it to her face, inhaled deeply, and closed her eyes. She wasn't ready to forgive everything. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But she could no longer deny the man before her now was not the man who had shattered her. He was rebuilding, and she was watching. Their conversations grew longer, more honest. They spoke about Elijah's development, about their own childhoods, about the fears that kept them up at night. Grace confided in Ethan how lonely those first weeks with the baby had been. How terrifying it was to love something that much while feeling so completely abandoned. "I kept thinking," she said one night, "that if I could just love him enough, maybe I wouldn't miss you." Ethan didn't interrupt. He sat quietly beside her on the sofa, hands clasped, head bowed. "I missed you in the delivery room," she continued, voice low. "I missed you at every 3 a.m. feeding, at every doctor's appointment. I grieved you like you had died." "I was lost," he said finally. "And I'm so ashamed of that, not just for you, but for him, for missing the beginning." Grace looked at him. "But you're here now." He nodded. "I won't leave again. Not ever." In late February, the family therapist, who had guided them gently through months of co-parenting sessions, suggested something new. A joint session outside of their roles as mother and father. One focused on the two of them as people, as former partners. As maybe, possibly, something again. They agreed. It was awkward at first. The room felt smaller than usual, the chairs closer. The therapist opened with a simple question. "What do you miss most about each other?" Grace was the first to speak. "I miss the way he used to look at me," she said, her voice wavering. "Like I was his compass, like I was the person who kept him tethered to the good inside him." Ethan's jaw tightened, his throat worked before he could find his voice. "I miss how she made me feel safe," he said. "Like no matter how high I climbed, she'd be there to catch me if I fell. I miss her laugh in the morning. I miss knowing she believed in me." They didn't cry. They didn't reach for each other. But the room changed. After that, the visits became longer. Dinner invitations appeared. At first, Elijah was always the centerpiece, his high chair between them, his chubby hands slapping mashed sweet potatoes onto the table like modern art. But after the baby went to sleep, they remained. Grace pouring tea, Ethan drying dishes, the weight of silence between them now filled with meaning, not pain. One night, as snow blanketed the windows, Grace said, "I've been thinking about going back to work." Ethan looked up from his cup. "Are you ready?" "I think so," she said. "I miss feeling useful beyond the house, beyond just being a mom." "You've never been just a mom," Ethan said. "But I get it, and whatever you need, I'll help." Grace smiled. "I know." Her foundation had reached out, offering her a flexible return as director of outreach. She accepted. And true to his word, Ethan stepped up. He reworked his consulting hours. He arrived at the estate early, took Elijah on walks, fed him lunch, even sang him down for naps with a lullaby Grace used to hum in their old San Francisco apartment. One afternoon, while Elijah napped upstairs and Grace was finishing a Zoom meeting, Ethan stood in the hallway staring at a framed photo on the wall. It was one of their engagement pictures, her in a sundress, laughing into his shoulder, his arms around her like he never wanted to let go. He hadn't known Grace was watching from the stairs. "Do you miss that?" she asked quietly. He turned. "Every day." She hesitated before stepping closer. "I don't know what this is," she said, "what we're doing, but it feels different." "It is," Ethan said. "It's real and slow and earned." A long silence passed between them. Then she said, "Would you stay for dinner tonight? Just the two of us?" It wasn't a date. It wasn't reconciliation. But it was something. They cooked together like they hadn't in years, chopping vegetables shoulder to shoulder, laughing when Ethan almost dropped the knife. They talked about college, about who they were before ambition and betrayal took over. After dinner, they sat on the porch with mugs of hot cider, at the stars stretching across the sky like stories waiting to be written. She didn't invite him to stay the night. He didn't ask. But when she hugged him before he left, it was longer, fuller. And in the days that followed, the warmth lingered. By early spring, they had settled into a new rhythm. Not quite husband and wife, not quite strangers finding each other again, but something liminal, tender, and alive. On a warm April afternoon, as cherry blossoms bloomed along the driveway, Grace asked Ethan to join her and Elijah for a picnic in the back garden. They spread out a blanket, packed sandwiches, peeled apples, and watched Elijah toddle between them with wide eyes and sticky fingers. At one point, he tripped and fell. Nothing serious, just a startled tumble. He looked at Ethan, then at Grace, unsure which parent to run to, and then, smiling, he toddled toward both of them, his hands outstretched, falling into their arms at once. It was in that moment, wrapped around their son, laughter tangled between them, that Ethan realized something profound. They were building something new. Not a return, not a rewind, but a resurrection. And for the first time since that disastrous night on the yacht, he believed, truly humbly, that maybe love once lost could be grown again from the ashes. Not as it was, but as it should have been all along. The first signs of summer came early that year. Soft golden sun spilling through budding branches, warm breezes curling through the windows of the Caldwell estate, and the quiet lull of a new kind of peace settling over their lives. It wasn't perfect, not by any means. But perfection was never the goal anymore. Stability was. Intention was. A love that grew, not rushed. A life that breathed, not burned. Ethan had begun arriving every morning before Elijah's first nap. Sometimes Grace was still in her robe, hair damp from the shower, eyes still sleepy. He never minded. In fact, he cherished those moments, the blurred lines between routine and intimacy, the small domestic rhythms that once felt so distant. On a Tuesday in June, Grace watched from the doorway as Ethan knelt beside Elijah's building blocks, patiently stacking towers and laughing softly when Elijah gleefully knocked them down. She sipped her tea and smiled, realizing something had quietly changed inside her. The anger was gone. Not forgotten, not erased, but gone. That evening, while Elijah napped upstairs and the sun painted the horizon in streaks of pink and lavender, Grace called Ethan into the living room. "I've been thinking," she said, her tone calm but steady, "about the next chapter." He sat down, cautious. "Okay." She hesitated, fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. I'm open to the idea of us trying again." Ethan's heart stuttered. I mean slowly, carefully, no rushing back into a life that hurt us both, but maybe building something new, together." He didn't speak right away. His eyes brimmed with a hope so raw it nearly made her cry. "I'll take it," he finally whispered. "Any version of you, of us." They didn't kiss. There was no dramatic declaration, No cinematic moment of reunion. Instead, they sat in the soft light, hands touching gently on the couch cushion between them, like two people finding their way back across a once broken bridge. That weekend, they went on their first walk as a family. No press, no photographers. Just a trail through the woods behind the estate, Elijah perched on Ethan's shoulders, babbling happily, Grace holding Ethan's hand. The quiet was easy, the laughter was real. Over time, the walls came down, plank by plank. Ethan moved into a small guest cottage on the Caldwell property, Grace's idea. It wasn't quite moving in, but it was something. It gave him proximity without pressure, access without intrusion, and it gave Elijah what he needed most. A father who was present, who tucked him in every night, who read the same story 5 times with the same silly voices, who was learning to show up in every possible way. Their evenings became a ritual. Dinner on the patio, a glass of wine, shared conversations about everything from diaper rash to the ethics of venture philanthropy. Sometimes they disagreed, sometimes they sat in silence, but they did it together. Ethan's career also evolved. He began mentoring young entrepreneurs full-time, those from underrepresented communities, those like him, who grew up thinking ambition was a distant star. He gave talks not about success, but about failure. Not about scaling startups, but about scaling your heart to hold both regret and redemption. He was honest about what he had done. He never sugarcoated it, and because of that, people listened. One night, after a particularly vulnerable speech at a local university, Ethan returned to the estate and found Grace waiting by the fireplace. "You told them about the yacht," she said, handing him a mug of tea. "I told them about losing everything that mattered while chasing what didn't." She nodded, watching the flames dance. "You've come a long way." "I still have further to go," he said quietly. "We both do." And that, somehow, was enough. By late summer, the conversation shifted again. Not because they planned it, but because growth has a way of demanding space. It was after Elijah's first birthday, a quiet celebration. Just them, Melissa, Grace's parents, and a single-tiered carrot cake that Elijah destroyed with both fists. That night, after the last dish was washed and the house had settled into a hush, Ethan looked at Grace across the kitchen island. "Would you ever marry me again?" Grace blinked. "Are you asking?" "I'm not," he said. "Not yet. But I think about it. And I wanted you to know that I'm not trying to go back to what we had. I want to build something better, from scratch. With you, if you ever want that." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked over, placed her hand gently on his chest and said, "Then keep building." And so he did. He built trust with every early morning diaper change, with every missed opportunity in favor of being home, with every honest word, every moment of restraint, every instance where he listened instead of defended. He didn't try to rush forgiveness anymore. He earned it slowly, brick by brick. Fall returned, and with it, a softness to their lives. Elijah was walking confidently, talking in half-formed sentences that made them both laugh until they cried. The house was louder now, messier, fuller. One evening, after putting Elijah to bed, Ethan found Grace on the back porch, wrapped in a sweater, looking up at the stars. He sat beside her, handing her a cup of cider. "I was scared," she said after a long silence, "of trusting you again, of trusting myself." "I know," he said, "but I think I've been waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. The old version of you. The one I married." "I don't want to be him again," Ethan said. "I want to be the man who learned what losing you meant." She turned to look at him, and in her eyes he saw not just the reflection of stars, but of every scar they had survived together. "I believe you," she said. And that night, for the first time in over a year, he stayed. Not because they were healed completely, but because healing, finally, felt possible. It was gentle, this new chapter, quiet, earned. And as they lay beside each other beneath the soft weight of memory and hope, Grace whispered, "You didn't just come back to me. You became someone I could fall in love with again." Ethan kissed her forehead and whispered back, "Then I'll keep becoming." Because in the end, redemption wasn't a grand gesture. It was 1,000 small ones, a steady hand, a patient heart, and the courage to begin again. Life lesson from the story. This story reminds us that love, no matter how strong, is not immune to betrayal, neglect, or pride. Ethan and Grace's journey is a powerful example of how easily we can lose sight of what matters most when we chase ambition at the cost of connection. Ethan had everything: wealth, status, admiration, but he lost the one thing he truly needed: the trust and presence of his family. His fall from grace wasn't sudden, it was gradual, made of small, selfish choices that snowballed into heartbreak. But this story also offers hope. Redemption isn't given freely, it must be earned. Through humility, accountability, and consistency, Ethan began to rebuild what he had broken. And grace, though hurt deeply, showed that healing is possible when there's honesty, time, and sincere effort. We learn that people can change, but only when they're willing to confront the darkest parts of themselves. And we learn that forgiveness is not weakness, it's strength. It takes immense courage to open your heart again after it's been broken. Ultimately, the most valuable things in life, love, trust, family, cannot be bought or faked. They must be nurtured, protected, and chosen again and again. Now we'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss another powerful story that speaks to the heart. See you in the next one.